What I am about to tell you now was sent to me by Andres, a retired doctor who spent more than 20 years working in rural towns before retiring in one of them. He wrote to me with that precision that doctors have to describe what they observe, without embellishments, without drama, just the facts in order. And yet, what he describes has no medical explanation that he himself can support. If you are subscribed to the channel, you already know that this type of testimony is what interests me the most. Rational people facing something that reason cannot cover. And if you are not subscribed yet, this story is a good reason to do so. This is what Andres experienced during the winter he spent alone in the mountains. I am a doctor. I was one for 31 years, and I say I was one because 3 years ago I retired, and since then I have been trying to convince myself that I no longer define my identity by that. I don't always succeed. I mention the doctor because it matters to understand how I process things. 31 years of rural medicine teach you to observe carefully, not to conclude before having enough information to distinguish between what you see and what you interpret. It's a training that becomes automatic, that enters into reflexes. When something happens, my first movement is neither fear nor a supernatural explanation. It is systematic observation. What happened to me in Paramo Grande resisted all my attempts at systematic observation. I moved to Paramo Grande when I retired, partly because I had spent 15 of my 31 years working in that municipality and the place had gotten under my skin, and partly because after decades in practice I wanted silence. Paramo Grande is a mountain village, over 2,000 meters high, with fog for most of the year, and a cold that is not aggressive but persistent, the kind that settles in your bones without you realizing it. About 300 people, a medical post where I had worked and where now a young doctor worked who didn't need my advice, although sometimes she asked for it out of courtesy. I settled in a house on the edge of the village, overlooking the hills and a garden that in spring had flowers I hadn't planted but the person who lived there before me had, and that returned on their own every year with that silent stubbornness of plants that have been in a place for a long time. The first months were exactly what I wanted. Tranquility, reading, walks in the hills, slow conversations with the townspeople I had known for years. Nothing extraordinary. The kind of life one imagines when saying they want to rest, which usually turns out to be more difficult to maintain than it seems, but in my case, perhaps because I was genuinely exhausted, it turned out to be perfect. I knew Doña Petra since my years as a doctor in the village. She was a woman of indeterminate age, one of those people who always seem to be 70 years old and will probably continue to seem that way for a long time. She lived alone in a house near the cemetery, cultivated a garden with a variety of plants that I, with my basic knowledge of medical botany, had never fully managed to identify, and had a reputation in the village that was difficult to categorize. Not exactly a healer, not exactly a witch, but something in the space between the two that the people of the village simply referred to as Doña Petra knows. What she knows exactly was something that no one could quite explain. But when someone had a problem that medicine could not solve, or a fear that could not be named, or a situation that escaped the usual frameworks, they went to see Doña Petra. I greeted her when I saw her. We had the cordial relationship of two people who respect each other without needing anything more. She had never asked me for anything, and I had never asked her anything. That changed in the second winter after my retirement. It started with the dog. I had a dog for a year, a large and calm animal, dark brown in color, that had shown up at my door one morning, with no visible owner, and had stayed with the same naturalness with which things that are meant to stay simply stay. I named him Medano, because he had the color of the sand from certain northern rivers where I had worked as a young man. Medano was a dog with a stable temperament. He didn't bark for no reason. He wasn't scared of the wind or the sounds of the mountain. He slept on the porch with that serenity of animals that feel completely secure in their territory. At the beginning of July, with winter already settled in the mountain, Medano started to behave differently. At first it was subtle. Certain moments when he would freeze, staring towards the northern hill, the one behind the house, with his ears up and his body tense. He didn't bark. He just watched. And when I approached to see what had caught his attention, I saw nothing. The hill covered with low vegetation and fog, as always. Then he started to not want to go out at night. Medano was a dog who enjoyed the cold nights, wandering the garden late and returning to sleep on the porch when his rounds were over. In July, he stopped doing that, As evening fell, he began to move restlessly, looking towards the door, and as soon as I opened it to let him out, he would stay at the threshold, looking outside, but without stepping out. If I went out first, he followed closely at my heels, not straying more than 2 meters away, with that body tension of animals on high alert. I observed him for several days before giving it importance. I looked for explanations. Some new animal in the hills, some scent that I couldn't detect, some change in the environment that Medano sensed before I did. I found no satisfactory explanation. The first week of August was when I saw him for the first time. It was around 11 at night. I had gone out to the garden to check that the water hose was properly closed, something I did out of habit because the early morning frosts could damage the pipes. Medano was following me closely, with that new tension he had adopted in the previous weeks. I looked towards the northern hill from the back of the garden, as I had done dozens of times, and at the edge of the hill, where the cultivated land ended and the wild vegetation began, there was a figure, a person, or what seemed to be a person, a dark silhouette standing completely still. The night fog made the edges diffuse, but the shape was unmistakably vertical, unmistakably human in its proportion. I stood still, watching. Medano began to tremble. Not a shiver from the cold, but the muscular tremor of an animal with genuine fear. That kind of involuntary response that animals cannot control even if they want to. The figure at the edge of the hill did not move. I waited a minute, maybe two, counting, observing, looking for any movement, any sign that it was a real person who had some understandable reason to be standing there at 11 o'clock at night in the cold of August. Nothing. I took Medano by the collar and entered the house. The next morning, I climbed up the northern hill to the point where I had seen the figure. I looked for footprints in the damp ground. I found none. The ground at that point was untouched, with the grass flattened only by the usual weight of moisture and wind, without any impression indicating that someone had been standing there. I returned home without a conclusion. The next thing took a week to happen, long enough for me to start thinking it had been a game of fog and shadow, an optical illusion produced by a tired brain in conditions of reduced visibility. It was the sound that changed that. In the second week of August, for 3 consecutive nights, I woke up at around 2 in the morning with the same feeling, that there was a sound outside that had interrupted my sleep. I didn't always remember the sound exactly upon waking, just the feeling that it had been real and that my brain had processed it even before I was fully conscious. On the third night, I stayed awake waiting, and it arrived. It was a sound difficult to describe precisely. Something between a whistle and a vocalization, with a low frequency that seemed to come from outside but resonated in a way that made it hard to pinpoint its exact origin. It wasn't the wind, which I knew well on that mountain after 2 years, and it wasn't any animal I could identify among those that inhabited the surrounding hills. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then it stopped. Medano, who had been sleeping in the room with me those weeks because he had stopped accepting the porch, was awake and paralyzed, looking out the window. The next morning I went to see Doña Petra. I found her in her garden, with her hands in the soil, harvesting something I didn't recognize. When she saw me arrive, she was not surprised, as if she had been expecting that visit. She offered me tea, prepared it with some leaves she took from an unlabeled jar, and we sat at the small table in her kitchen. I told her everything. Medano's behavior, the figure on the hill, the sound in the early mornings. Doña Petra listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around the cup, looking at me with that particular attention of someone who listens not only to the words, but to what is behind them. When I finished, she remained silent for a moment. Then she asked, "Have you seen any new person wandering around the village in the last few weeks?" I thought. Paramo Grande was a village where new faces were noticeable. "There is a woman," I said. "She arrived about a month ago. She lives in the Gutierrez's house, which has been vacant since they went to the city. I don't know her name." Doña Petra nodded slowly. "Have you seen her up close?" "Only from afar, on the main street." I paused. "She is older, long hair, she always goes alone." Doña Petra fell silent for a moment that felt long. "Have you noticed anything in your animals when she passes by?" she asked. I thought of Medano, in the weeks of altered behavior. "The dog," I said. Doña Petra nodded. "Animals know before people do," she said. And then, choosing her words carefully, "There are people who have the gift of changing, of going out at night one way and another way. She paused. In this town, in the hills around here, that has always been known. There is a name for it, but the name doesn't matter. What matters is that it is known when one is near. A nagual? I said, because the term existed in my vocabulary, even though I had never taken it literally. Doña Petra looked at me with an expression that was hard to read. Something like that, she said. Although that word comes from another tradition and it's not exactly the same. What exists here is older than that name. What do you want from me? I asked, because something in everything Doña Petra was not saying pointed towards that. She lowered her gaze to her cup. You were a doctor here for a long time, she said. You knew a lot of people. You know things about many families in the village. A pause. There are those who seek that kind of knowledge. For someone to know the secrets of many people is something that holds value for certain purposes. I didn't respond immediately. I processed that with the part of my brain that has been systematic for decades. What kind of purposes? I don't want to speculate, Doña Petra said, but there are ways to obtain that knowledge that are not conversation. The tea had cooled in my cup without me having touched it. What do I do? I asked. Doña Petra got up, went to a high shelf, and brought back a bundle of dried herbs tied with black thread and a small cloth bag that weighed more than its size suggested. The herbs are burned inside the house, in every room, before sleeping. She handed them to me. The bag goes under the pillow. Do not open it. What's inside? Things you wouldn't recognize even if you saw them. Doña Petra looked directly at me. Do you trust me, doctor? It was the first time she had called me doctor in all the years we had known each other. Yes, I said. Then do not open it. I followed her instructions that night. I burned the herbs in every room, with the bitter, earthy smell filling the house, and placed the bag under the pillow. I felt, as I had felt before in similar situations, the rational discomfort of a man of science following instructions he could not verify, and something deeper, older than medical training, that recognized the seriousness of what I was doing. That night there was no sound in the early morning. The next one neither. On the third night, yes. But this time it was different. The sound started the same, that low and hard to locate vocalization, but it lasted less, and it had a different quality, as if it came from farther away, or as if something prevented it from arriving completely. It stopped before 2 minutes, abruptly, like when something is cut off halfway. Medano was still awake and tense, but he no longer trembled. The next day I went down to the village early and crossed paths on the main street with the woman that Doña Petra and I had mentioned. It was the first time I saw her up close. She was older, as I had said, with completely white hair, straight and long down to her shoulders. She walked slowly, with a shopping bag, and when I passed by her side, she looked up and stared at me. She had very light brown eyes, almost yellow, that shone in the morning light, in a way that was not exactly normal, but also not unequivocally abnormal, just striking. She looked at me for the second that our paths crossed, and in that second, I saw something I didn't know how to process. No hostility, no threat, but recognition, as if she knew exactly who I was and what I had done those last nights, and was assessing what that meant. I walked past. I didn't stop. That afternoon I saw Doña Petra again and told her about the encounter. She listened to me and then said, "You know she has protection." A pause. People like her don't insist when they know there's someone who understands what's happening. They look for places where no one knows. Will she leave the town? I asked. Probably. Doña Petra looked at me. But doctor, one more thing. She got up and went to a kitchen drawer, took something out, and brought it to me. It was a folded sheet of paper. This is in case you see something again on the northern hill, in case the sound returns. She handed it to me. These are words that are said aloud, looking toward where the sound comes from. You don't need to understand them, just say them. I took the paper, I opened it. There were some lines written in a mix of Spanish and something else I didn't recognize, in a handwriting that wasn't Doña Petra's but older, as if she had copied something from another document. How long have these words been in your family? I asked, because something in that handwriting told me they had history. Doña Petra smiled slightly, the first time I had seen her smile in this entire conversation. More than I care to tell, she said. I put the paper away. The woman with the white hair left the Gutierrez house 10 days after our encounter on the street. She simply left, without notifying anyone, leaving the house exactly as she had found it. The only trace of her stay was a persistent smell in one of the rooms that the owner of the house, when he returned to check it, described as burnt earth, and something else he could not name. The nighttime sounds ceased completely. Medano regained his usual temperament in less than a week. He returned to the porch, resumed his nighttime rounds, and returned to that stable serenity he had before July. I continued burning the herbs that Doña Petra had given me once a week until they ran out. The cloth bag remains under my pillow. I have not opened it. I am a doctor. I have spent 31 years looking at the human body with the conviction that everything has an explanation if one searches carefully enough. And I still believe that, in the broadest sense. But there is a space between what science can verify today and what exists in the world, and that space is not small. What happened in Paramo Grande that winter lived in that space. I have no diagnosis for that, and for the first time in 31 years, the absence of a diagnosis does not bother me. My son Tomas came to visit me in September, when winter was already easing. He is a doctor too, like me, and we spent a long afternoon drinking coffee and talking about work, about his life in the city, about changes in the healthcare system. At some point he asked me how life was in the village. I told him it was fine, that it was quiet. I didn't tell him anything about what had happened. There are things that need the right context to be heard, and my son has not yet reached that point in his life where certain contexts open up on their own. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. What I do know is that when Thomas left and I was alone in the house with Medano sleeping on the porch and the mountain night outside, I sat in the garden and looked at the northern hill for a good while. It was still, dark, the fog moving slowly over the vegetation. Nothing. And yet, before going in, I took Doña Petra's paper out of the pocket where I've kept it since that afternoon, and I read it aloud once, looking towards the hill, just in case. The words I don't understand but say anyway. Because there are things that medical training does not cover, and that are better handled with the kind of knowledge that takes longer to acquire in the world. That's all I have to say. Thus ends Andres' story. He wrote to me that he still lives in Paramo Grande, that Medano is doing well, and that Doña Petra and he have tea from time to time without talking much about that. He says that is enough. It seems to me that what weighs most in this story is not the threat itself, but what it demanded from a man used to explaining everything, to accept that there is knowledge older than his own, and to trust in it. If this story resonated with you in any way, I would like to read it in the comments. And if you have something stored that no one has heard yet, you know where to find me. Have a good night. We'll talk in the next one. Before this story, I want to tell you something. The testimonies that affect me the most are not those of monsters or dramatic apparitions. They are those of completely normal people who, at some ordinary moment in their lives, come across something that doesn't fit into any framework they know. Lucia wrote to me 3 weeks ago. She is an architect, works with plans and measurements and structural logic, and yet what she told me has no explanation that she can support. If you also have something like that stored away, something that doesn't add up and that you haven't been able to tell anyone, write to me. But now, join me inside a colonial building in the historic center, and to what Lucia found in the basement during a restoration that no one should have started. I have been working in the restoration of historic buildings for 15 years. It is a job that requires a particular way of seeing things. It is not enough to know about structures and materials, although that is the foundation. One must learn to read a building as one reads a text. Each layer of paint over another, each repair on top of a previous one, each modification that someone made at some point for a reason that the building still holds even though the person is no longer there. Old buildings have memory. I knew that since I started in this, and for 15 years it seemed to me a nice metaphor and nothing more. After the Carranza building, it stopped seeming like a metaphor. The Carranza building is in the historic center of the city, on a corner that has been called that since the 18th century, although the current building is from the 19th century. 4 floors, gray quarry facade, entrance hall with arches leading to an interior courtyard with a dry fountain. It had been at different times a family home, a minor convent, a warehouse, and government offices. When it was assigned to me, it had been abandoned for 12 years, with structural damage on the 3rd floor, and a basement that no one had catalogued because access was blocked by a partial collapse of the internal staircase. The task was to carry out a complete survey before deciding whether the building was restorable or if only the facade needed to be demolished and rebuilt. Routine work for someone with my experience. I assumed it would take me 2 weeks, 3 at most. I started on Monday. My assistant on that project was Camila, who had been working with me for 2 years and had that uncommon combination of technical precision and genuine curiosity that makes someone very good at restoration. Camila measured, photographed, and took notes with an efficiency that had earned my trust since the first project. We dedicated the first day to the exterior and the courtyard. The building was in better condition than I expected from the outside. The load-bearing walls were still solid, the humidity was manageable, and the damage on the 3rd floor was localized. I began to think it would be a relatively clean restoration. At the end of that first day, while we were packing up the equipment in the courtyard, Don Heriberto appeared. He was a man of about 75 years, very thin, always wearing a white shirt, buttoned up to the collar regardless of the heat. He was the caretaker of the building, or had been for the last 20 years, a figure that the municipal agency managing the property had forgotten to remove when they abandoned the premises. Don Heriberto continued to come every day, sweeping the courtyard, keeping the entrances closed, living in the caretaker's room next to the hallway with a small stove and a bed. No one had evicted him because no one remembered he was there. He introduced himself very formally, told me he was the building manager, and then without me asking anything added, "You can't go down to the basement." I told him that the basement was part of the survey and that we needed to catalog it. Don Heriberto looked at me with small, very calm eyes, which do not betray urgency, even if they feel it, and said, "You don't go down to the basement. That has always been known here." I asked why. "Because it has an owner," he said, and didn't add anything else. That night I told Camila what the old man had said while we were reviewing the plans in my office. Camila smiled in her practical and affectionate way and said, "All old buildings have a man like that, who knows things no one asked him." She paused. "Are we going down to the basement tomorrow?" "The day after. First, let's finish the upper floors." We spent Tuesday and Wednesday on the upper floors. The 3rd floor had the most severe damage. A sagging ceiling beam, dampness that had seeped in for years through a crack in the roof, some walls with cracks that required intervention, but nothing that couldn't be treated. Camila measured and I dictated, and the work progressed with that satisfying rhythm of things coming together as they should. On Thursday we reached the basement. The internal staircase that led down to the basement had partially collapsed, as previous reports had stated. The first 3 steps had given way, but further down the staircase remained intact. With a portable ladder, we salvaged the fallen section and descended. The basement was large, much more than the superficial plan suggested. It extended beneath the entire building in a series of chambers connected by low arches, with vaulted brick ceilings that moisture had darkened to nearly black. The floor was made of packed earth. The air was dense, with that particular smell of spaces that have been unventilated for decades. Old earth, damp wood, something mineral that I couldn't identify. We turned on the portable lights and began to work. The first chamber had nothing particular. Masonry walls, empty niches that had served for storage, a drainage channel in the center that no longer functioned. Camila measured and I took notes. Ordinary work. The second chamber was deeper, connected to the first by a low arch that forced one to bend down. There, the floor had something different. In the center, in an area of perhaps 2 meters in diameter, the floor was darker than the rest, with a different texture. As if at some remote time, there had been a hearth or something that burned regularly. I photographed that in detail, noted the dimensions, and moved on. The third chamber was at the back, separated from the second by another arch. This one smaller, barely 1.5 meters high. I had to bend down quite a bit to pass through. Camila entered behind me. This chamber was different from the other 2. It was smaller, almost circular, with a lower ceiling, and on the walls there were engravings. Not paintings, but engravings, lines traced directly into the stone with some sharp instrument, with a depth that spoke of patient and repeated work. The engravings covered all four walls from floor to ceiling, and although I did not recognize any writing system in them, I did recognize that they had an organization, that they were not random. There were figures that repeated, something that could be a tree, or could be a human figure with arms raised, something that could be an eye or could be a sun, and a smaller figure, repeated dozens of times in different sizes and positions, that I did not know what it was. Camilla stood still beside me, looking at the walls. "Lucia," she said softly, for no apparent reason to lower her voice. "I see," I replied, also in a low voice. "We photographed everything, every wall, every section, the details of the repeated figures. It took longer than expected because it was important material, the kind of finding that completely changes the approach to a restoration. We went up to the courtyard and found Don Heriberto sweeping by the fountain, as if he had been waiting for us. He looked at us when we came out and said, without any prior question, 'You've seen the engravings.' It wasn't a question. 'Did you know they were there?' I asked him. 'Everyone who has taken care of this building has seen them,' Don Heriberto replied. He continued sweeping, long before I did, and everyone knew the same thing, that chamber is not to be touched.' 'What's in that chamber, Don Heriberto?' The old man stopped sweeping. He looked at me for a moment, then looked at Camilla, and then looked back at me. 'The one who takes care of the building,' he said. 'What do you mean by that?' Don Heriberto leaned the broom against the wall of the fountain with a calmness that contrasted with the weight of what he was saying. 'When they built this building, or when they built what was there before the building, they made a deal.' He paused. 'Someone who lived in that place before there was a city wanted to stay there, and those who built on top let him stay, in exchange for taking care of the building.' Another pause. 'What is in that chamber is not a ghost, it is not a dead person, it is something that has always been there and has been taking care of this place for centuries.' Camilla and I looked at each other. 'A goblin?' Camilla asked, with a mix of curiosity and skepticism that was very much her. Don Heriberto twisted his mouth a bit, as if considering whether that word was appropriate. 'Something like that,' he finally said, although that name comes from children's stories and what is down there is much older than any story. That afternoon, back in my office, I searched for historical references about the Carranza building. I found what is usually found in the archives of colonial buildings: property records, transfers, some partial plans from the 19th century. But I also found something I didn't expect. A marginal note in an inventory from 1887, written in small handwriting and faded ink, which said, "The bottom basement is not to be intervened. Condition of the property since foundation." Since foundation. No further explanation. I slept poorly that night, not because I was exactly afraid, but because I had too many questions and no satisfactory answers, and that combination always keeps me awake. On Friday, I returned to the building alone before Camilla arrived. I wanted to speak with Don Heriberto without an audience, with more time and more calm. I found him in the doorman's little room, drinking coffee from a tin cup. I invited him to talk, and he nodded without surprise. We sat in the courtyard, with the morning still cool, and the city beginning to wake up outside the walls. I asked him everything I wanted to know. Don Heriberto responded patiently, with the calmness of someone who has had a long time to organize what he knows and is willing to share it with anyone who is willing to listen. He told me that his predecessor, the caretaker before him, had explained the rules of the building on the first day of work, just as his had explained them to him. An oral transmission chain that Don Heriberto did not know how many generations it had. The rules were simple. Do not go down to the bottom basement, except to ensure that everything is in order. Do not move or touch the engravings. Do not bring metal objects to the bottom basement, especially tools. And once a month, on the night of the new moon, leave an offering at the entrance of the third chamber. Bread, a little salt, clean water. Have you done it? I asked him. The monthly offering. Since the first day, Don Heriberto said without hesitation. 20 years. And have you seen anything? Have you ever seen what is in that chamber? The old man took a moment before answering. Once, he said. Years ago, when I was just starting out. I went down to leave the offering and took longer than usual because I tripped in the dark. He paused. When I turned on the flashlight, I saw something in the arch of the third chamber, at the threshold. What did you see? Don Heriberto clasped his hands over his knees. Something small. Another pause. Like a child. But it wasn't a child. The proportions were wrong. The arms too long, the head too big, and the eyes. He stopped. The eyes were the only thing that shone with the flashlight, like a cat's eyes in the dark, but in a color I couldn't name. What did you do? I put the offering on the ground as quickly as I could and went back up. Don Heriberto looked at me. And I never went back down to leave the offering at night again. Since then I leave it at noon. Did you see it again? No. But sometimes when the building is very quiet, you can hear something. Small footsteps in the basement, or something moving between the rooms. A pause. But that tells me it's still there, that it's still watching over. I asked him what it meant for it to watch over. If anyone had seen concrete evidence of that. Don Heriberto nodded slowly. This building has been abandoned for 12 years, he said. Without maintenance, without intervention. The stone facade is perfect. The load-bearing walls have no structural damage. The roof has withstood 12 years without anyone checking it. He looked at me. Have you seen abandoned buildings for 12 years in this climate? I had seen it. Buildings that in 5 years without maintenance turned into ruins. The Carranza building, after 12 years of abandonment, was in a condition that I had considered surprisingly good on the first day. I didn't respond, but I thought about it. Camila arrived mid-morning, and we worked the rest of the day in the first 2 levels of the basement, carefully cataloging, but without approaching the 3rd chamber. I had decided not to go back in there without knowing exactly for what and with what. It was that afternoon, almost at the end of the day, when the first thing happened. We were in the 2nd chamber, Camila measuring the drainage channel, and I was checking the masonry of the north wall. The portable light was between the two, casting a stable white light over the space. The light went out. There was no electrical failure, no prior flicker. It simply went out, abruptly, and we were left in total darkness. Total darkness in a basement is different from any other kind of darkness. There is no residual light source, no reflection from any origin. It is a complete denial of vision, so absolute that the brain starts to construct images where there is nothing. Camila said my name in the darkness. Here I am, I said. Don't move. I'm going to turn on the phone. I turned on the phone's flashlight. The portable light was on the ground between the two of us. Off. I bent down, picked it up, checked the button. It turned on without any problem. Camila looked at me with an expression that I described to myself as cautiously calm. Did it fall? She asked. It was on the tripod, I said. The tripod is still standing. We looked at the tripod. It was exactly where we had placed it, stable, with no visible reason for the focus to have separated from it. Maybe the connection, Camila said. I checked the connection. It was firm. We didn't say anything else. We finished what was left and went upstairs. That night I told Camila what Don Heriberto had said about the rules and the offering. Camila listened without interrupting, with that expression of hers of someone processing information before giving an opinion. When I finished, she said, "Are we bringing metal tools to the basement today?" I thought. "The steel meter," I said. Camila nodded slowly. One of the rules was not to bring metal. I didn't respond to that immediately. Then I said, "I'm not saying we believe in this." "No," Camila said, "but I'm also not saying we shouldn't take it into account." The following Monday, before going down to the basement, I left at the entrance of the 3rd chamber what Don Heriberto had described to me. Bread, salt, water in a small container. I felt ridiculous doing it, but I did it. Camila was behind me and said nothing. We worked that week without incidents. The lights didn't go out again. The work progressed well. I began to get used to the peculiarity of the place, with that gradual adaptation that humans have to normalize almost anything if the exposure is continuous enough. But on Wednesday of that week, something happened that I couldn't normalize. It was 3 in the afternoon. Camila had gone up to get more batteries for the spare flashlights, and I was alone in the 2nd chamber reviewing some notes. The basement was silent, with that silence of underground spaces that absorb sound in a way different from surface spaces. And then I heard it. It came from the direction of the 3rd chamber, from the low arch that connected the 2nd with the 3rd. It was a small sound, almost delicate, like footsteps. Footsteps of something walking on the ground. Slow, unhurried, not like rat footsteps, which are quick and random. They were slow and deliberate steps, with a rhythm that had something almost reflective. I stood completely still, listening. The footsteps reached the arch and stopped. I directed the flashlight towards the arch. Only darkness beyond the reach of the light. And then, at the exact boundary where the light from my flashlight ended and the darkness of the third chamber began, I saw the eyes, exactly as Don Heriberto had described them. Two small points of light, at a height of perhaps 1 meter and 20 from the ground, shining with that reflection that certain animals' eyes have in the dark, but in a color that was neither green nor red, nor any color I could name precisely. Something between amber and something darker, something that had no reference in my previous visual experience. I did not move. The eyes did not move either. We looked at each other, if you can call that looking, for what seemed to me like several seconds. And in that time, without being able to explain where that certainty came from, I felt that what was watching me from the darkness was not hostile. It was not threatening. It was simply something that was evaluating, calibrating, deciding. Then the eyes disappeared, without visible movement, without sound. They simply stopped being. When Camila came down with the batteries, I found her sitting on the floor of the second room with her back against the wall, the flashlight pointing at the arch, and an expression that she later told me she had never seen me have. I told her what I had seen. Camila sat next to me against the same wall, and was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think it's what Don Heriberto said?" "I don't know what I think," I said honestly. "But it didn't do anything to you?" "No." Another silence. "The building is in very good condition," Camila said, and in her voice there was something that was not exactly fear, but a kind of careful consideration. "For 12 years of abandonment." "I know." We finished the work for that day and went upstairs. As we passed by the arch of the third chamber, I did not look inside. I don't know if Camila did. In the following days, I finished the survey. My final report to the municipal agency recommended the complete restoration of the building with specific conditions. The basement could be catalogued and preserved as a space of archaeological value, but the third chamber had to remain closed to the public and without any intervention of any kind. I justified that recommendation with technical arguments about the fragility of the engravings and the structural risk, which were valid arguments, even though they were not the real ones. The recommendation was accepted. I told Don Heriberto that the building was going to be restored and that it would probably need an official caretaker during and after the process. I asked him if he wanted to continue in that role. He looked at me with that calmness of his and said, "I'll stay as long as I can. Someone has to know the rules." I asked him if he thought that what was happening in the third chamber would still be there during and after the restoration. Don Heriberto thought for a moment. "It's been there since before there was a building," he said. "A restoration isn't going to move it." I finished the project 3 weeks after starting it. The Carranza building was declared a candidate for priority restoration and entered a process that, according to the usual timelines of the organization, would take between 2 and 4 years to begin. I returned to my other projects, but there is something I haven't been able to let go of since then. Something I wonder every time I pass through the historic center and see the gray stone facade of the Carranza building on its corner. On my last day there before leaving, I went down to the basement one more time, alone. I reached the arch of the second chamber and stood there, without a flashlight on, in the darkness, for a moment, and I said, in a normal voice, as one speaks to someone in the same room, "The building is going to be restored. The third chamber will not be touched. The rules remain." Silence. And then, from the darkness of the arch, the sound of something moving. Small deliberate steps retreating toward the back of the third chamber. I didn't see the eyes that time, but I heard it move away, and something in that sound, in that quiet and unhurried retreat, gave me the feeling that whatever was down there had understood. Or maybe it simply continued doing what it had always done, which is to take care. That was 8 months ago. The restoration of the Carranza building has not yet begun. Don Heriberto is still there, sweeping the courtyard, leaving the offering every new moon, taking care of what he has been taking care of for decades. And the third chamber remains closed. For now, that's the only thing I can say with certainty. And that's where what Lucia wanted to tell me ends. She told me that she still passes by the Carranza building from time to time, that she looks at the facade from the sidewalk and thinks about what is underneath, in that third chamber with its engraved walls and its eyes in the darkness. What stuck with me the most from her story is this. That there are things that did not come after us, but were there before, and learned to coexist with what came on top. If this story made you think of something, I would love to read it in the comments. And if you have a story of your own waiting to be told, you know there's a place for that here. Take care. We'll talk soon. Before starting this story, I want to tell you something. Not everyone who writes to me does so to impress anyone. Some do it because they need someone else to know what they experienced, even if it's a stranger on the other side of the screen. That's how I received the message from Andres, an accountant from Guadalajara, Mexico, who wrote to me one weeknight with few introductory words and a lot of detail in what followed. If you're subscribed to the channel, thank you for being here. And if you arrived today for the first time, this is a good story to stay for. What Andres experienced during the weeks after his family moved to a new house is the kind of experience that forever changes the way one looks at the dark corners of their own home. I am an accountant. I work with numbers, with balances, with logical structures that have to add up to the cent. My brain works that way. It seeks order, identifies inconsistencies, solves problems methodically. I am not a person who is swayed by impressions or gut feelings. Lucia, my wife, always told me that I was the kind of person who needed to see something 3 times before believing it. She was right. Until I experienced something that no matter how many times I saw it, it remained just as impossible. It all started with the move. Lucia and I had been looking for our own house for 4 years. We lived in a rented apartment in a central area of Guadalajara that felt small and consumed a considerable part of our monthly income. When we found the house in the southern neighborhood of the city, we both knew it was what we were looking for. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, a small garden in the back, a reasonable price for the size and location. It was a quiet neighborhood, with well-maintained houses from the 70s, with trees on the sidewalks that provided shade to the street during the day. We bought it in July. We moved in August, in the middle of the heat. The first days were the usual chaos of any move. Boxes everywhere, furniture in temporary positions, the feeling of living inside something that still wasn't completely yours but was slowly taking the shape of a home. Lucia took care of the kitchen and the bedrooms. I took care of the living room, the study, and the utility arrangements. We slept well those first nights, with the productive tiredness of someone who has done concrete things during the day. The house smelled of fresh paint. The previous owner had repainted it before selling it to us. Clean white walls that gave it a fresh and neutral look. There was something pleasant about that smell, about that whiteness, the feeling of a space without history, of a place that had not yet accumulated anything. Later, I understood that this feeling was completely wrong. The first sign was Lucia. My wife is intuitive in a way that I have always found difficult to categorize. She wasn't exactly superstitious, didn't believe in astrology or rituals, but she did have a sensitivity to spaces and people that I lacked. She would enter a place and say, "Something isn't right here," or "I feel comfortable here," with a certainty that often turned out to have some real basis that I had not perceived. I attributed it to her ability to read subtle details that I overlooked. The temperature, the light, the way people moved in a space. 5 days after we moved in, Lucia told me that the bedroom on the ground floor, which we had designated as the guest room, made her uncomfortable. Uncomfortable how? I asked. I can't explain it well. When I go in there, I feel like the air is different, heavier. I told her it was probably the ventilation. That bedroom had only one small window that faced the side garden, while the others had larger windows. The logic of air circulation perfectly explained the difference in temperature and density. Lucia looked at me with that expression of hers that meant she accepted my explanation but didn't find it sufficient. We didn't talk about the subject anymore that night. 2 days later, Lucia told me something different about the same room. Andres, last night I dreamed about that bedroom. What did you dream? That I was inside and there was someone standing in the corner. A man. I couldn't see him well because it was dark, but he was there, standing, looking at me. I asked her how she had felt in the dream. She told me that she hadn't been exactly afraid, but rather something more like the discomfort of feeling watched without consent. I told her it was normal to dream about new spaces while the brain processed them. That our mind takes time to incorporate new places and sometimes populates them with things during the night. Lucia nodded, but remained silent for the rest of breakfast. The first concrete thing I couldn't explain happened a week after the move. It was 11 at night, on a Tuesday. Lucia was already asleep upstairs. I was in the study finishing a report that I had to submit the next day. The study was on the ground floor, next to the guest room. I worked for an hour with concentration, not paying attention to the rest of the house. When I finished and turned off the computer, in the silence that followed the noise of the fan from the equipment, I heard something. It was a very low sound, almost at the limit of perception, like someone breathing, slow and steady, in the next room. I stood still, listening. The sound continued. It was rhythmic, consistent, with the cadence of someone sleeping, or completely still but awake. Too regular to be the wind, too organic to be any mechanical system in the house. I slowly got up and went to the guest room door. It was closed. I put my hand on the doorknob and waited a moment, listening from the hallway. The sound was coming from inside, without a doubt. I burst open the door and turned on the light. The room was empty, the bed unmade, the boxes we still hadn't unpacked piled against the wall. No one, nothing out of place. The sound had disappeared the moment I turned on the light. I stayed in the doorway for a while, scanning the room with my eyes, looking for anything that could explain what I had heard. Nothing. I closed the door and went up to the master bedroom. Lucia was sleeping peacefully. I lay down carefully so as not to wake her, and spent some time staring at the ceiling before falling asleep. I didn't say anything the next day. I didn't want to worry her about something that probably had an explanation that I hadn't found yet. But in the following days, more things piled up that also found no explanation. On Wednesday, the guest room door, which I had closed before going to bed, was open the next morning. Not wide open, but ajar, about 20 centimeters. On Thursday, Lucia told me that the night before, while I was sleeping, she had woken up and felt that there was someone else in the bedroom. She hadn't seen anything, but the feeling had been so clear that she had turned on the light and checked the whole room. On Friday, I myself had the dream. It was the same one that Lucia had described to me, a figure standing in the dark corner of the guest room, looking towards where I was. In my version of the dream, the figure was more defined than in Lucia's description. It was a man, tall, wearing dark clothes that could have been from any era because there were no clear details. He was doing nothing. He was just there, with total and fixed attention directed at me, with something in that attention that was not exactly hostility, but something colder and older than hostility. I woke up with my heart racing. Lucia was awake too, looking at me. "You dreamed of him too," she said. It was not a question. "How do you know?" "Your face when I woke you up. It's the same face I made." I sat on the bed and spent a moment in silence processing everything. The sounds, the door, the parallel dreams, Lucia's discomfort from the first day. "I'm going to check the house," I said. "I already know what you're going to find," Lucia said. "Nothing, or nothing you can see." She was right about the first part. I checked the entire ground floor, starting with the guest room, then the study, the kitchen, the living room. Nothing out of place. Doors and windows closed. No signs of entry. That morning, Saturday, I went out for a walk around the neighborhood under the pretext of exploring the area, but with the real intention of clearing my head and thinking clearly. It was early. The street was almost empty, with the smell of wet earth from the gardens that the neighbors had watered. On the sidewalk across the street, sitting in a plastic chair in front of his door, was an old man who watched me approach with the calm attention of someone who has all the time in the world. "Good day," I said. "Good day," he replied. "You are the one who bought the Mondragon house." The Mondragon was the surname of the previous owners. I told you yes. Don Ezequiel. He introduced himself without getting up from the chair. We talked for a few minutes about the neighborhood, about the improvements that had been made in recent years. Don Ezequiel was a measured man, with precise words, who looked at his interlocutor with an attention that uncomfortably reminded me of the figure from the dream, although I quickly told myself it was an unfair association born from fatigue. He was the one who brought up the topic without me saying anything. "How have you slept in the house?" I looked at him. "More or less," I said cautiously. Don Ezequiel nodded slowly. "The downstairs bedroom," he said. It was not a question. I stayed silent for a moment. "What do you know about that bedroom?" Don Ezequiel looked towards the house with an evaluative expression. "I know what everyone who has been on this street for years knows. That room has had something for a long time, since before the Mondragon family, since the family that lived there before them, who built the house." I asked him what it was. Don Ezekiel took a moment before answering, as if he were carefully choosing how much to say. The man who built that house in the 70s died inside it, in that room. Natural causes, they said. But his family always said that in his last weeks that man had changed in a way that didn't correspond to any illness. That he would lock himself in that room for hours, that he talked to himself, that he said things that didn't make sense. His family thought it was the deterioration of old age. But the eldest daughter, already old herself before she died, told anyone who would listen that her father hadn't died alone in that room. What did she mean by that? That there was something with him, that she had seen him once, standing in the corner while her father was sitting on the bed looking at him, that he was a dark man who did not belong to that house or to any place she could name. The cold I felt at that moment was not the cold of the early morning in Guadalajara. It was another kind of cold, internal, that comes when something one tried to keep in the category of inexplicable but probably rational suddenly shifts to a completely different category. And the Mondragon? I asked. Did they see him too? The Mondragon never used that room. They had it locked. Mr. Mondragon once told me that when they bought the house, the real estate agent mentioned to them that there were some stories about that room, but that they were just rumors from neighbors. Mondragon locked the room and never thought about it again. But his children never wanted to sleep in that part of the house. I asked Don Ezekiel if there was anything that could be done. The old man looked at me for a moment. There is a lady in the Americana neighborhood who handles these kinds of things. She is not a healer or anything like that. She is a woman who studied these situations for many years and knows how to manage them. If you give me her number, I will call her myself to explain. I agreed. Don Ezekiel went into his house and returned with a phone number written on a piece of paper. He handed it to me without further ceremony. That afternoon, I told Lucia everything. I told her about the sounds, the door, and what Don Ezekiel had said about the man who died in that room, and the figure his daughter had seen in the corner. Lucia listened to me in silence. When I finished, she said, I already knew. Not what you just told me, but that there was something. Since the first day. I know. What are we going to do? Call the lady that Don Ezekiel recommended. Lucia nodded. The lady's name was Amparo. She was in her 50s, spoke with academic precision, and when she arrived at the house the next day, the first thing she did was ask me to show her every room without telling her anything about which one concerned us. She wanted to reach her own conclusions without me contaminating them. I followed her around the upstairs without her saying anything special. Then we went down to the ground floor. She passed through the kitchen, the living room, the study, and when she reached the closed door of the guest room, she stopped without me saying anything. This one, she said. Yes. Amparo opened the door and entered. I stayed in the doorway, observing. She moved slowly around the room, stopping especially in the corner where the figure of the dream always stood, and passed her hands through the air of that corner with a concentration that was not theatrical but completely functional, like a doctor palpating something that her hands know better than her eyes. Then she left and closed the door. There is a presence, she said in the hallway, with the same calmness with which she could say there was dampness in the wall. Masculine, ancient. It has been in that corner for a long time. I don't think it is the person who died in that room, or not just that person. I believe what is there is older, and that the man who died simply found it, just like you did. I asked her what exactly it was that he had found. Amparo chose her words carefully. There are things that settle in places for reasons we cannot always trace. Some came because someone invoked them. Others simply find a space where the energy is favorable to them and stay. What is in that room belongs to the second category, I believe. It has no specific intention to cause harm, but its presence generates a disturbance in the people who sleep nearby because it radiates something that the nervous system perceives as a threat, even though it is not in the strict sense. Can it be removed? It can be limited, and it can be instructed that it does not have access to the rest of the house or to the people who live in it. It is not always possible to completely expel something that has been in a place for so long, but a boundary can be established. What Amparo did during the next hour, I will not describe in detail because there are parts that I did not understand well enough to explain them accurately. What I can say is that she mainly worked in the corner of that room, with items she brought in a cloth bag, and that when the room was finished it felt different in a way that I didn't expect to perceive but did nonetheless. Lighter, more neutral, as if something that had been there accumulating presence for years had receded to a distance that no longer reached the threshold of the door. Amparo told us that the bedroom could be used, but that it was preferable not to sleep there for at least a month. That what she had done was establish boundaries, not eliminate the presence, and that it needed time to settle. She also told us something I didn't expect, that the dream we both had, the figure in the corner, was probably the way that presence communicated its existence, not with the intention to scare, but because it was the only form of contact it had with sleeping people, to show itself in the space where dreams occur. "Do you know what it's doing?" I asked, unable to help myself. "Is it aware?" Amparo looked at me with an expression that wasn't exactly patience but was close to it. "That question doesn't have a simple answer. What I know is that it responds to limits, and that's enough to work with it." A month passed, then another. We didn't hear the breathing again. We didn't have the dream again. The guest room door stopped opening by itself. We used that room for the first time as a guest room in December when Lucia's mom came to spend the holidays. We didn't tell her anything about what had happened. She slept well every night, reporting nothing strange. But Lucia and I know that something is still there. Not because we feel it with the same intensity as in the early days, but because there are moments, very occasional, when passing by that closed door, I sense something that has no exact name. A quality in the air, a change in temperature of a degree or two, the brief feeling of being aware of something that is also aware of me. It happens in a second and then it goes away. Amparo told us that there would probably always be some of that the presence would not disappear but would remain contained, and that as long as we respected the boundaries she had established, what remained there would respect ours. We have been in that house for a year and a half. We have made it our own. The furniture has found its permanent place. The backyard now has plants that Lucia tends to with dedication. The study has become my favorite space for work. It's a house with history, like all old houses. Only ours has a story that most of the neighbors know and that we know too, in a way more direct than we would have preferred. That's all Andres wanted to tell me. Andres closed the message with an observation that I haven't been able to get out of my head. He said that the most disturbing part of the whole experience wasn't the figure in the dreams or the sounds at night, but realizing that something had been in that corner for decades, watching all the families that had lived in that house, and that none of them knew it completely. That ignorance didn't make it any less real. It seems to me a very honest way to end a story like that. If you've ever bought a house or rented an apartment and felt from the beginning that something wasn't quite right, I would like to read it. The comments are there. We'll talk soon. There are messages that arrive and one knows immediately that they will not be able to ignore them. This one was sent to me by a listener named Catalina, and she sent it to me at 3 in the morning, which already says something about the state in which she wrote it. She told me that she had tried to fall asleep and had been unable to, that she had been unable to for weeks, and that writing it was the only way she had found to get out of her head what she experienced last winter in her family's house, a house in the mountains where she and her brother went to spend a few days after their father's funeral. If you are listening to this and have something you need to share, the comments are open. Now let me take you to that house, to that winter, and to what Catalina found behind a door that her father had specifically asked her never to open. My father died on a Tuesday in February, not dramatically, not suddenly. He had been sick for 2 years, and the last few months had been a gradual decline that everyone in the family saw coming. And yet, despite everything, no one was prepared when it arrived. He died in the hospital, with my brother Tomas and me on either side of the bed. And the last thing he did before losing consciousness for good was squeeze my hand with a strength that did not correspond to his condition, and tell me something that at that moment I did not fully understand. He said, "Don't go to the mountain house alone," not as a suggestion, as an instruction, with that precision of the last words that matter. I told him, yes, okay, because that's what you say when someone who is dying asks you for something. And he closed his eyes and did not speak again. 3 weeks after the funeral, Tomas and I went to the mountain house. I need to explain what that house was to understand why we went. My father had bought it decades ago before Tomas and I were born, in one of those impulses that young men sometimes have to own a piece of a remote place in the world. It was small, made of wood and stone, on the slope of a mountain about 4 hours from the city where we lived. It was not a summer house in the usual sense. My father would go alone sometimes for days. My mother had never wanted to go. She said the place gave her a bad feeling, that there was something about it she didn't like but couldn't pinpoint what. Tomas and I had gone as children a couple of times in the last years of our parents' marriage before the divorce, and we both had vague and contradictory memories of those visits. After the divorce, when I was 12 and Tomas was 14, our father continued to go alone. He never talked much about what he did there. He said it was his place to think, to be still. We accepted it with the indifference that children have towards their parents' quirks when they are teenagers. But there was something more about that house that I had always known without anyone explicitly telling me. There was a room that my father never opened when we were around. It was at the back, at the end of a short hallway. It had a lock that did not match the style of the rest of the house, newer, clearly installed later, with care. My father never mentioned it. And there was a certain specific tension in the way he inhabited that house when we approached that hallway, an attention that he disguised well but that I, who had always been more observant than Tomas, had noticed since I was a child. When he died, among his things we found the key. There was no indication of what it was for. There was no note, just a key in the drawer of his desk at home, which Tomas recognized immediately. "It's for the house," he said. "Which lock?" I asked, although I knew. Tomas looked at me, the one in the back room. We looked at each other in silence for a moment, and without speaking about it further, we both knew we were going to go. I remembered what my father had told me in the hospital. Don't go alone. And I wasn't going alone. I was going with Tomas. I convinced myself that that was enough. We arrived at the house on a Friday afternoon, with the sun already setting behind the mountains and the cold of the mountain settling in the air with that specific density it has in February, when winter has not yet said its last word. The house had been uninhabited for months. It smelled closed, of cold wood, of that particular smell of places that have been alone for a while. We turned on the heating, opened windows to ventilate, made the beds with linens we found in the hallway closet. These were practical gestures that were also gestures of something else, of beginning to understand that our father was no longer going to do those things himself. That night we did not open the room. We had for dinner what we had brought from the city, spoke little, and went to bed early. It was one of those nights when the tiredness is not physical but of another kind, the accumulated fatigue of weeks of mourning and paperwork and difficult conversations. I fell asleep quickly, which was a relief. But I woke up at 3 a.m, not because of a sound exactly, but because of the absence of sound. The kind of silence that has a specific weight, that feels different from the normal silence of 4 a.m. I stayed still listening, and it was then that I perceived it. A smell, soft, barely perceptible. A smell of old smoke, of something burned a long time ago that had no obvious source in a house with electric heating. I got up. I walked through the house. Everything still. Thomas was sleeping in his room, the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, everything normal. I stopped in front of the short hallway at the back. The smell was stronger there. It was coming from behind the closed door. I went back to my room. I didn't sleep anymore that night. I didn't. The next morning, with coffee in hand and daylight streaming through the windows, Tomas and I took the key from the drawer where we had kept it and stood in front of the door to the back room. Tomas had the key. I was a step behind. The hallway faintly smelled of that old smoke, although weaker than the night before. "Are you sure?" Tomas asked me. "No," I said honestly, "but open it anyway." He inserted the key. He turned it. The mechanism yielded with a clean click, and the door opened inward. The first thing was the smell. More intense now, old smoke mixed with something that took me a while to identify and that I finally recognized as incense, the specific thick kind used in certain religious rituals which seeps into the walls and lingers for years. And beneath that, something harder to name, something organic and ancient. The room was small, smaller than I expected, as if the walls had been modified at some point to reduce the space. There was no window. The only light came from the open door behind us. In the center of the room was a low table made of dark wood. On the table were things arranged with a precision that was clearly intentional. Several candles of different sizes burned down to various levels, some to the base. A clay bowl with dark residue at the bottom. Several small objects that took me a while to identify. Bones, I thought at first, but looking at them more closely, they were branches of carved wood, shaped in forms I did not recognize. And in the center of it all, on the wood of the table, something traced with a dark material that could have been charcoal or something different from charcoal. A design, complex, symmetrical, with an internal logic that was perceptible even though I could not decipher it. On the walls there were marks as well, not painted but engraved, in the wood, covering practically the entire surface of the 4 walls from floor to ceiling. It took me a moment to realize that they were words, not in Spanish, not in any language I recognized. A writing that could have been ancient or could have been invented, executed with a meticulousness that represented hours, days of work. "Dad did this," Tomas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. We stood in the doorway without entering. I was registering every detail with that attention the brain adopts when processing something that has no available category to classify it. Tomas still had his hand on the doorframe. "How long do you think it's been like this?" he asked. "I don't know." I looked at the candles, the distribution of dust on the table, the condition of the marks on the wall. Years, many years. Tomas exhaled slowly. "What was he doing here?" he said, and in his voice there was something that wasn't exactly fear, but something adjacent to fear, the feeling of having discovered that someone you knew had an inner life you never imagined. I didn't respond because I had no answer. We spent that day going back and forth to the room. We didn't enter, or at least I didn't enter. I stayed in the doorway looking, trying to understand what was in front of me. Tomas did enter at noon, being careful not to touch anything. He examined the marks on the walls up close, photographed everything with his phone, looked under the table, and found a flat wooden box that he carefully took out and opened in the room. Inside there were papers, many papers, handwritten in my father's handwriting with dates spanning decades. The oldest were from before Tomas and I were born. The most recent were dated the previous year when my father was already ill. We read them for hours. It was a diary, although not exactly. It was more like a record. My father documented on those papers something that had begun long before Thomas and I existed, something he called by different names at different times. The deal, the agreement, the debt. The first papers spoke of a period in his life when things had gone very wrong, a crisis I had never known because it happened before I was born, debts, the threat of losing everything, and of someone he had found or who had found him, someone who had offered him a way out. The details of that meeting were fragmented and sometimes almost incoherent, as if my father had wanted to record it but also wanted not to say it too directly. There were references to a place in the mountains, to a nighttime meeting, to words that were spoken and that he noted phonetically because he didn't know how to write them any other way. And there was a description of the agreement that made its fundamental content clear, even though the precise details remained obscure. My father had asked for something, and something had given it to him, and in return he had to keep certain conditions open for the rest of his life. The room was part of those conditions. What was in it? The candles, the marks, the bowl, all of that was the maintenance of something he had committed to decades ago, and that had to be sustained continuously. The most recent papers, written with the shaky handwriting of his illness, had a different tone than the previous ones, more urgent, more worried. The last note, dated just 4 months before his death, said this, and I remember it exactly because I read it so many times that I memorized it without intending to. "I haven't been able to keep the conditions this month. My body won't allow it. I'm afraid of what comes when I can no longer do it. I'm afraid of what will remain unfinished. I don't know how to finish it without consequences. I don't know if there's a way to finish it." And below, added later in another ink, as if it had been written at another time, "Let Catalina not go alone." Tomas and I looked at each other when we finished reading that last paper. Outside, the sun had already set, and the windows showed that specific darkness of the mountains in winter, without city lights, without visual references, just solid black and the sound of the wind in the trees. "We have to go," Tomas said. "Yes," I said, but neither of us moved immediately. I was processing what I had just read. Not the supernatural part, not yet. But the other thing, that my father, for decades, had carried alone something that terrified him, that he had spent years in that small windowless room doing things he didn't fully understand but felt he couldn't stop doing, that in his last months, sick and alone, his greatest fear had not been death but what he would leave unresolved, that the last thing he had told me was a warning. That not going alone meant, now I understood, that if you went, you needed someone. Not because the place was physically dangerous in a way that two people could handle better than one, but because there was something there that needed to be confronted and that he had spent his life postponing that confrontation. "What do we do with the room?" I asked. Tomas thought. "We close it," he said, "and we decide later, when we're not in the middle of it." It was reasonable. I got up. I went to the back hallway. The door to the room was open, just as we had left it. The light from the hallway illuminated the threshold and the edge of the table with the candles. Everything was still. I reached out my hand towards the door to close it, and then the candle in the center of the table lit up. By itself, without any visible source of ignition, the flame simply appeared, small and perfectly still in the still air of the closed room, and with it the smell of incense intensified suddenly, filling the hallway with that density I had perceived the night before. I remained absolutely still. The flame did not flicker. It did not move. It was stable in a way that flames are not stable under normal conditions. Tomas came into the hallway behind me, and when he saw the lit candle, he stopped as well. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Tomas, with a calmness that seemed extraordinary to me given the circumstances, said, "Catalina, close the door." I closed the door. The click of the lock was the most definitive sound I remember hearing in my life. That night we didn't sleep. We stayed in the living room with all the lights on until dawn, quietly talking about the papers, about what we had read, about our father and what had happened in that house for decades. We talked about things we had never talked about the years after the divorce, when he had suddenly started to thrive after difficult years, about the distance that had always existed between him and the world, that way he had of being present but also being in another place simultaneously. About the times Tomas or I had tried to ask him about the house and he had skillfully changed the subject, making the conversation flow elsewhere without one realizing it until later. And we talked finally about what we were going to do. We decided that we couldn't just leave the room as it was, not because we had a clear plan of what to do, but because we both felt, with that certainty that doesn't require rational explanation, that leaving without doing anything was leaving something incomplete that our father had spent his life trying to keep under control. Tomas suggested dismantling the room, taking everything out, cleaning the marks, leaving it empty. I wasn't sure that was the right or safe thing to do, but I didn't have a better alternative either. We spent the next morning emptying the room. We did it together, Tomas and I, with the lights on and the living room windows open even though it was cold, because we needed to know there was a visible and nearby exit. We took out the table, the bowl, the carved objects, the candles. Everything went to the backyard where we made a bonfire. We covered the marks on the walls with a thick white paint we found in the garage, layers and layers until nothing was visible. It was hours of work. When we finished, the room was just a small windowless room, empty and white and with nothing to distinguish it from any unused storage space. We closed the door. We kept the key. That night I slept, deeply, without interruptions, for the first time since we had arrived. We left the house the next day with the first light. Before we left, we both stood for a moment in front of the house, looking at it from the front yard. It was a small and ordinary house on the slope of a mountain, with its wood and stone and its windows reflecting the gray sky of February. There was nothing on its exterior that suggested what had been inside for decades. Tomas asked me if I thought we had done the right thing. I told him I didn't know. I said we probably would never know for sure. He nodded. It was an honest answer, and we both knew it. What I do know is that since that day nothing has happened that I can attribute to that house. I haven't felt that smell of old incense in places where it shouldn't be. I haven't had dreams related to what we saw. The house is still there. Tomas and I decided not to sell it for now, not for reasons we can clearly articulate, but simply because we are not ready yet. But there is something that stayed with me from that experience that doesn't quite go away. My father spent decades holding on to something he didn't fully understand. He did it alone, in silence, without telling anyone who could help him. And in his last hours of lucidity, what mattered to him was not his death, but what he was leaving incomplete. That says something about the weight he carried, about what that deal, whatever that deal had been, really cost him. Not the success he achieved, not the decades of prosperity that came afterward, but the years in that dark windowless room, holding on to only something that scared him, unable to tell anyone. That's what I carry with me. That's what I can't quite shake off. And that's all Catalina told me she was willing to share. There ends Catalina's testimony. She wrote to me that the house is still standing and that for now they prefer not to do anything with it. She also told me that she found more papers later in the city house among her father's belongings, but she decided not to read them. There are things that are better left closed, and I think Catalina knows that better than anyone. What struck me about this story was not the room or the candle. It was the father carrying something alone for decades. If this story moves something inside you, let me know in the comments. And if you have your own story kept away, you know there's a place for it here. Have a good night. We'll talk in the next one. Have you ever arrived at a place where from the very first moment you felt that it didn't want you there? Not in a hostile or violent way, but in that silent manner, like when you enter a room and something in the air tells you that you don't belong. That was exactly what Isabel felt from the first day she arrived at the sidewalk where she was going to teach. Isabel is 28 years old, she is a teacher, and she wrote to me from a municipality in the south of Colombia just over a month ago. Her message was long, very detailed, and it was clear that she had kept it inside for a long time. If you also have something stored that you would like me to narrate here, write to me. Now, let me tell you what happened to Isabel during the semester she spent living on the edge of the mountain and why she never walked alone after sunset again. I never thought I would end up requesting a transfer before the year was over. When I was assigned to the La Oscurana pathway, I read the name on the paper and felt something I couldn't quite name at that moment. Not exactly fear, more like an unease, like when you pronounce a word that doesn't quite sound right even though you don't know why. La Oscurana. I asked the coordinator of the education department if that was the official name or a nickname. She told me it was the official name, that it had appeared on all maps for over 100 years, and not to worry, that it was a quiet pathway, that the school was small but in good condition, and that the parents were cooperative. I signed the papers. I packed my things. I left. The path was 2 hours from the town center by an unpaved road that the public truck traveled 3 times a week. What wasn't on the papers was that the school was another 20 minutes on foot from where the truck dropped off the passengers, along a horse path that bordered the mountain. I found out when I arrived and asked the driver how to get there. He pointed towards the mountain and said to me, "Take that path. Go straight and don't stray." Those last 4 words he said with an emphasis that didn't match the casual tone of the rest of the directions. He didn't clarify them. He left. The school was exactly as they had described to me. Small, with unpainted block walls, a zinc roof, 2 classrooms, and a small room in the back that served as housing for the teacher. The principal's name was Sophia. She was about 40 years old, had a friendly face, and always busy hands. She welcomed me with coffee and efficiently showed me around, like someone who has already received several city teachers who arrive with scared faces and leave before the first month is over. I asked her how many students there were. She told me 19, from 1st to 5th grade, all in the same classroom with her while I attended to the other group. I asked her how many teachers had passed through that position in recent years. She looked at me for a moment before answering. Some. She didn't add anything else, and I decided not to ask further either. The first week was normal. The children were shy at first but curious, and by the 3rd day, they were already asking me questions that were hard to answer and bringing me fruits and corn that their mothers sent as a welcome. I made the horse path twice a day, morning and afternoon, and the mountains on the sides were dense and green and smelled of damp earth and something floral that I couldn't identify. In the afternoons, when I returned to the village to do the shopping I needed before the store closed, the path felt different under the low light of sunset. The shadows among the trees were deeper. The sounds of the mountains changed register. But I told myself it was just the effect of the hour, that it was natural for a forest path to feel different at night than during the day, and I kept walking. It was the 2nd week when I started to notice the small things. The first was the silence. Not the comfortable silence one associates with the countryside, but a sudden and total silence that fell over the road at certain moments, as if everything living in the woods had decided to fall silent at the same time. Birds, insects, the wind among the leaves, everything cut off abruptly for 30 or 40 seconds, and then gradually resumed. It happened 3 times that week, always in the same stretch of the road, right where a huge tree with exposed roots marked a bend. The second thing was harder to rationalize. One morning upon arriving at school, I found on the entrance step a small figure made of intertwined branches. It was crude but deliberate. It had a human shape, with limbs tied with plant fiber and what seemed to be human hair tangled on top. It wasn't animal hair. It was smooth and dark, the kind that children from the area have. I asked Sophia if she knew what it was. She looked at it for a second with an expression I couldn't quite read, then picked it up and threw it behind the school without saying anything. I pressed her. What was it? She told me, "Things from the woods. Don't pay it any mind." That answer seemed insufficient to me, but the tone in which she said it made it clear that I wasn't going to get more information that way. I casually asked the children during a class if they knew which wild animals to be careful of. Several answered, snakes, wasps, the bull from Mr. Fermin's farm. Then a third-grade girl named Paola, who had the most serious eyes I have seen in an 8-year-old, said without anyone asking her directly, "And the goblins." The other children fell silent in a way that did not seem like the normal reaction to a curious answer, but rather something more akin to deference. I asked Paola what she knew about goblins. She told me, "They live in the wild. If you look at them, they follow you home. And they pull the hair of girls with braids." She touched her own braids as she said it. I noticed that all the children had short hair, or it was neatly tied up. That afternoon, on my way back along the horseshoe path, I pushed thoughts of goblins and branch figures into a corner of my mind and told myself they were local legends, part of the area's culture, the kind of stories passed down from generation to generation to keep children close to home. Just like the bogeyman or the man with the sack. Beliefs that didn't deserve me, with my studies in pedagogy and my urban mentality, giving them more weight than they had. But at that very moment, just as I passed by the tree with exposed roots, silence fell. This time it lasted longer, perhaps a full minute, and during that minute in the woods to my left, about 10 meters among the trees, I heard something I had not heard before, a laugh, not an adult's. It was high-pitched, short, like the laugh of a small child laughing at something private, and it came from deep in the woods, where there was no path and where no child should have been at that hour. I walked faster without running, which was the unspoken instruction that the body gives itself in those moments to not admit that it is afraid. I arrived at the store. I bought what I needed. I returned to school along the path with still enough light to see well. I didn't hear anything else. That night I wrote to my mom in the chat. I asked her if she remembered stories about goblins from when she was a child. She replied with several enthusiastic audio messages about the goblin that supposedly scared a neighbor in the neighborhood when she was 12 years old. It wasn't exactly the information I was looking for, but the sound of her voice helped me sleep. The third week, the dreams started. They were not nightmares in the conventional sense. There were no chases or monsters. It was always the same scenario, the horse path, at night, with a light that had no identifiable source, a kind of gray brightness that covered everything. I walked along that path and knew, with that certainty that only dreams have, that I must not stop. And on the hillside, on both sides, there were presences that I did not see directly but perceived in the periphery, like shadows moving among the trees in rhythm with my steps. I never reached any destination in the dream. I just walked, and the presences followed me. I always woke up before dawn, with the feeling that the room was cold despite the heat outside, and with a smell in the air that took me several days to identify. It was the same floral scent from the path, the one I had not managed to name, but more concentrated, as if someone had entered the room carrying it on their clothes. One day, while checking my hair in the morning, I found a knot. Not the kind that forms when you move while sleeping. It was a deliberate, tight knot in a specific strand, like the one made intentionally with fingers. I untangled it with difficulty. The next day, there was another one in a different strand. I tied my hair up before sleeping. The next morning, the updo was undone, and there were 2 new knots. I went to talk to Sophia. This time she did answer me, but we sat outside under the school's eaves, and she spoke softly even though there was no one nearby. She told me that the goblins of that mountain were something the inhabitants of La Oscurana had known forever, that there were families who had been living alongside them for generations by following certain rules, not entering the mountain after sunset, not imitating their laughter or whistling at them, not looking directly at the trees when movement was heard. She told me that the goblins had a special interest in young women with long hair, that they would pull their hair while they slept as a way of getting attention, and that if one responded to that call, if one sought them out in the mountain instead of ignoring them, things could get complicated. I asked her what it meant to complicate things. She said that they follow you wherever you go, that you start to hear them even when you're not near the mountain, and that if you go into the mountain at night looking for them, sometimes you don't come out. I asked her if she had seen them. She looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I was born here. I learned the rules since I was a child. You arrived 3 weeks ago and they are already noticing you." Then she stood up and walked into the room as if the conversation was over. That same afternoon, as I was leaving school towards the village, I encountered an old man on the road whom I had not seen before. He was sitting on a stone at the edge of the path, wearing a straw hat and with a machete crossed over his knees, looking at the mountains with the expression of someone who has been staring at the same thing for a long time. He greeted me as I passed and called me by my name, even though I had not told him. I asked him how he knew my name. He said, "Everyone knows who the new teacher is." He introduced himself as Don Aurelio. He asked me if I had trouble sleeping. I said yes. He nodded as if he expected it. He told me to stay for a moment and listen to what he wanted to tell me. Don Aurelio told me what no document from the education department mentioned about La Oscurana, that the name came from the first families that settled there, who called it that because the hill bordering the path had a particular darkness even during the day, a density that the light did not fully penetrate, that in that hill lived something that the old people simply called the thing from the hill, which could take the form of animals or small children to approach people, and that had a special appetite for newcomers, for those who did not know the rules, that there was a woman who lived on the edge of the hill, further inside the official path, who was the only person who had learned to speak with that thing from the hill, and that when things got complicated for someone, that woman could help. I asked him who that woman was. Don Aurelio said his name in such a low voice that I barely heard it. Transito. He told me that she wasn't exactly a person from the village, that she had been living on that edge of the mountain for more years than anyone could remember, and that going to see her at night was a bad idea, but that during the day I could find her by following the official path a little beyond where it ended, towards where the trees began to close in. He said that if I wanted things to return to normal, for the knots in my hair and the dreams and the laughter among the trees to stop, it might be worth going. I went to the store, did my shopping, and returned to school. That night the dreams were more intense. The presences in the dream mountain were closer to the path. They no longer just moved among the trees but stopped at the edge, right where the darkness began and the gray light ended, and they looked at me. I couldn't see their faces, only their silhouettes, small, the height of 5 or 6-year-old children, with a rigidity in their posture that was not childish at all. I woke up at 4 in the morning. The room smelled intensely of that mountain perfume. And in the silence of that hour, with complete clarity, I heard from outside the window, just a few meters away, the laughter, the same as on the path. Sharp, short, repeated twice. I remained motionless in bed until dawn. The next day, a Saturday, there were no classes. I told Sophia that I was going to walk along the path for a while. She asked me how far. I told her maybe as far as the official path went. She looked at me for a second and said, "Are you going to look for Transito?" I said maybe. She nodded with a slowness that seemed resigned to me. She said, "Go in the morning, before noon, and don't accept anything to eat or drink that she offers you." I thanked her. She didn't say anything else. I left at 8 in the morning. The path was bathed in light and the birds sounded normal and the forest smelled of wet earth from the previous night's rain. I told myself it was a beautiful place, that under normal circumstances I would be one of those walkers who seek exactly this, silence and green and clean air. I passed the tree with exposed roots. There was no sudden silence. I continued. Beyond where the official road ended, there was a narrow, barely marked path that led into the trees. I followed it for 10 minutes, with light filtering through the foliage in slanted rays that made the space within the woods brighter than I would have expected. And then I saw the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, with a roof covered in moss. It had a narrow porch with a couple of dry leather chairs. And in one of those chairs, as if she had been waiting for me, sat a woman. She was very old. One of those old ages that have no precise age, that could be 80 years or 120. She had white hair tied in braids, which seemed significant to me, although I couldn't say why. Her eyes were a light color that didn't match the dark tone of her skin, a color between gray and green that the mountain light made strange. She looked at me with the same expression as Don Aurelio by the roadside, without surprise. She said to me, "Isabel." Not as a question, but as a confirmation. I said yes. I told her that I had been told she could help me. She indicated for me to sit in the other chair. I remembered what Sophia had told me, and when she moved inside the ranch, I assumed to bring something. I told her I didn't want anything, that I had had breakfast. She returned without bringing anything, sat down, and asked me what I had seen and heard. I told her everything. The silences along the way, the figure of branches, the laughter among the trees, the knots in the hair, the dreams, the laughter outside the window. She listened without interrupting me, with her hands on her knees and her eyes somewhere between my eyes and the mountain behind me. When I finished, she remained silent for a while that felt long to me. Then she told me that the mountain had already marked me, that when something from the mountain marks someone, especially a newcomer, that person either needs to leave or someone needs to negotiate for them. That leaving without doing anything meant taking them along, that they didn't stay in the mountain but continued on, that in the city they were confused with dreams or stress or mental health issues but that they didn't leave, and that staying without doing anything wasn't an option either because the interest increased over time. I asked her what negotiating entailed. She explained to me with the patience of someone who has explained the same thing many times, that the mountain was not evil in the sense that people understood it, that it did not want to harm her but functioned as a sustained attention, like when a wild animal gets used to a person and starts to follow them, that the negotiation was simple. I had to leave something at the edge of the mountain, something that was mine, something personal, and that served as a boundary, as a way of telling it that this was where my space ended and to respect that edge, that she would accompany me to the tree with exposed roots, which was the point where the mountain had started to notice me, and that I had to leave the object without looking towards the mountain while doing so. I asked her what kind of object. She said, "Something that you use close to your body, that has your scent." I was wearing a thread bracelet that my mom had given me when I graduated from university. I had worn it without taking it off for 4 years. I showed her the bracelet. Transito looked at it and nodded. We walked back together along the path to the official road. She walked with a dark wooden cane and a pace that was not slow but also not what I would have expected from someone her age. We didn't talk during the journey. When we reached the tree with exposed roots, she stopped a few meters from the tree and indicated for me to approach alone. She said quietly, "Place the bracelet on a root. Don't look towards the mountain, and don't say anything while you do it." I approached the tree. The smell of the mountain was intense there, that mix of damp and floral that I already knew well. I crouched down and placed the bracelet on a root that stuck out of the ground like an arch. The earth beneath was soft and dark. I kept my eyes on my hands and on the root and on the earth. I didn't look towards the mountain, but I listened. It was the first silence, the usual one, that total cutoff. And then, during that silence, something approached. I didn't see it. I only heard it. Footsteps on the dry leaves of the forest floor. Light, irregular, like someone who doesn't weigh much. They stopped a few meters from where I was, and there was a breath, barely audible, curious. I got up. I walked back to Transito without running, with all the calm I could muster. She looked at me when I reached her side and said, "Good." We started walking back to school. There was no sudden silence during that journey. The birds sounded all the way. That night I slept differently, deeply, without dreams. Or if there were any, I don't remember them. The room didn't smell of anything strange. In the morning, I checked my hair. No tangles. A week passed, then another. The bridle path was just a path. The mountain on the sides was just a mountain. The children continued to take care of their hair. The mothers kept sending fruits as a thank you. And Sophia would occasionally look at me with an expression that I learned to interpret as, "Is everything okay?" To which I would respond by nodding. I didn't go looking for Transito again. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. Sometimes I think I should have asked her more questions. That there were things she knew that she didn't tell me because I didn't ask them. Who she was exactly. How long she had been on that edge of the mountain. What she had negotiated herself to stay there all those years without anything from the mountain bothering her. At the end of that semester, I requested the transfer. Not out of fear, or not just because of that. It was because La Oscurana demanded a type of attention and an adaptation that I wasn't sure I could sustain. There are people who are born in those places and learn their rules from childhood and carry them in their bodies naturally. I was not that person, and it's better to recognize it in time than to stay until something you don't fully understand decides that it has spent enough time watching. My transfer was approved for the following academic year. The last time I walked along the horseshoe path, I looked at the tree with exposed roots as I passed. The bracelet was no longer there. I suppose the water or the wind took it, or some animal found it, or maybe something else took it away. I don't want to know which of the three options is correct. That's all I can tell, or all I'm willing to share for now. And there ends Isabel's testimony. She wrote to me at the end of the message that she still misses the children from La Oscurana, especially Paula, the one with the serious eyes who knew more than an 8-year-old should know. What stays with me the most from her story is that image of something from the woods that simply notices you without malice, like an attention that no one asked for and doesn't know how to turn off by itself. If you know stories from your region about goblins, entities from the woods, or places with rules that no one wrote but everyone respects, tell me about them in the comments. I love it when you share that kind of tales. Have a peaceful night. And if you live near a forest, don't look between the trees when you hear movement. We'll talk soon.